The last thing we're going to figure out in our journey and our narrative with God is the names and the name changes that happen in our life. And biblically, there's a lot of examples of a name change taking place. Abram to Abraham, Simon to Peter, and Gideon to Jerubbaal. And these name changes are significant because they're symbols, they're representations of the work that God does in our life. And all journey and narrative places of our life lead to an identity shift. So as you are obedient and you're full of faith, or you walk with God by faith and not by might, and you do all of the things we've talked about in these narrative journeys and seen as these characters had shifts. As you begin to do these things, or as you do these things in your life, you literally change your identity. Your identity becomes different and you become transformed. I like to think of it like this, that if I look at my history up to a certain point, Samuel was known by something. 15-year-old Samuel, when people knew me, was known by something. That my name, I was known by something. But then if they met me after several years of transformation or several years of life, at 30, all of a sudden, Samuel, there was differences to that name. There was differences to what it meant. And so in the Bible, it was represented or seen that when somebody went through significant transformative or covenant dynamics with God, journey dynamics, that the name shift was representative of the amount of change that happened in their identity. And we see these beautiful places like Simon to Peter took place when he saw Jesus as Son of God. And that's a beautiful place. That reality is such a significant journey for us to understand, that when we look at Gideon's story here and some of the culminating moments of this part of it, is that there was a name shift that took place. And when we see ourselves walk by faith and courage with the voice of God and in the direction it's calling us, it'll lead us to some scary places. But if we're able to journey it out, we'll see a complete identity shift. And so in Judges 6:24 through 27 and 32, we'll dabble a little bit in some of these scriptures here. It says, "Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, 'The Lord is Peace.'" And this is in the context of he just had an encounter with the angel of the Lord. And to this day, it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to Abiezrites. That night the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here, with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of Asherah that you shall cut down." So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him to do. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by light. A small note on this. I love that even though Gideon wasn't perfect, like he still had fear, and so he did it at night, that he did and he was obedient to God even while he was still struggling with fear. And I think a lot of times we want to be obedient to God after we've had the victory over fear. But sometimes being obedient to God and the overcoming of fear, like the overcoming of fear doesn't happen before you're obedient. And I want to encourage you in that, because I think a lot of people struggle with fear and struggle to do what is obedience because of that fear. But do it afraid. If you can't do it without fear, do it afraid. And when we see that Gideon ended up doing this, in verse 32 it says, "Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar." And in this context, the people were upset. They wanted to bring Gideon out and they wanted to kill him. And his father stood in this place and named him his earthly father. And I love this shift in the perception and the name of Gideon, because you really see that he was in a place of fear, he was timid, and he really struggled to believe the narrative that God was establishing. And isn't that true for us? That we see and hear the narrative of God, but oftentimes we really struggle to believe it. We struggle and we wrestle to truly place our confidence in it. And when we see what Gideon did here in response to that, he was obedient to God, even though he didn't feel transformed and he wasn't transformed yet. But transformation took place after obedience. And this is a huge key in our journey of our name change, our shift in identity and transformation, is that transformation usually and almost oftentimes takes place after we choose to be obedient. And that's a beautiful thing that God does with us. And I want to encourage you that hear the voice of God, see the narrative that God is doing through the Word and through prayer and through fellowship and connection with other Christians, and hear what is God cultivating, be obedient in it, and then watch God transform you. And I believe that if you're obedient, you'll see God transform you, and you'll be known in a way that was very different. It was almost a stark contrast to who you were in the last season of brokenness, in the last broken narrative of your life. Because Gideon was almost known as a man that contended or almost spat in the face of Baal, that tore down the altar, the idol of Baal, and basically his name change was he was known by a man that basically stood up and said, fine, then let Baal contend, let Baal fight me if he will fight me. And that's a really ostentatious place. That's a very strong place. That's almost like a fine. Who's gonna challenge me? Is Baal are you gonna challenge me? Then come challenge me. That's a real place of strength. That's a real place of confidence and courage. So we see this shift in identity take place from a man of fear to a man of courage. And I want to encourage you as you're journeying with the Lord, as you're walking and finding new narratives that He's unfolding in your life, and you're making covenant connections with Him, to be full of courage, to obey and watch God transform you.